Imagine you blink, and every single human being on Earth is simply gone. Not dead, not visible anywhere, just gone. 8 billion people vanished in an instant. No warning, no bodies, no goodbyes. The coffee machine is still running. The traffic lights are still cycling. And the planet is about to spend the next 10,000 years quietly erasing every trace that we were ever here. This isn't science fiction fantasy. Scientists, engineers, and ecologists have actually mapped this out, hour by hour, year by year. And the timeline is stranger, faster, and stranger than you'd expect. The first hour changes almost nothing. Planes are still in the sky, but without pilots, most will eventually crash once autopilot runs out of fuel or hits a programmed limit. Cars stall in the middle of highways. Subway trains, on automated lines, keep looping through empty stations for a while, announcing stops to no one. Within 24 hours, the lights start going out. Most power plants need constant human maintenance. Coal plants run out of fuel on the conveyor belt. Nuclear plants are built with automatic shutdown systems, so most will scram safely and go cold, not meltdown, contrary to what people assume. But without anyone monitoring cooling systems for years afterward, a handful will eventually fail. Cities that never sleep go dark within days. Within a week, without pumps running, most major cities begin to flood. New York's subway system is a spiderweb of tunnels sitting below the water table, and it takes teams of engineers running pumps around the clock just to keep it dry. Stop those pumps, and the tunnels fill with water in about 36 hours. Within a year, the streets above start collapsing as the ground beneath them erodes. This is where it gets genuinely wild. Nature doesn't wait politely. It moves in immediately. Within a few weeks, without herbicides and constant mowing, weeds start cracking through sidewalks and parking lots. Seeds that have been lying dormant for decades in cities begin to sprout in the gaps. Within a single year, most lawns and gardens are overtaken. Within 5 years, many suburban streets look more like meadows than neighborhoods. Trees are the real architects of this transformation. Ecologists who study urban rewilding estimate that within 20 years, forests would begin reclaiming abandoned cities from the outside in, starting at the edges and pushing toward the center. Root systems crack foundations. Vines climb walls. Within 50 years, many wooden houses will have collapsed entirely. Roofs caved in by decades of unmaintained water damage and freeze-thaw cycles. Steel and concrete last longer, but not forever. Without paint and maintenance, steel bridges typically begin serious structural failure within about 200 years, as rust eats through support beams. Concrete, everyone's favorite permanent material, is more fragile than people think. Water gets into tiny cracks, freezes, expands, and slowly turns concrete structures to rubble over centuries. The scientists who study this scenario in the most detail point to one structure as the ultimate stress test, the Hoover Dam. Built to essentially never need human intervention, engineers estimate it could stand largely intact for thousands of years, possibly outlasting the pyramids, quietly holding back a lake that no one is left to use. And what about the animals? This is one of the most surprising parts. Within days, pets that depend entirely on humans, like most dogs, would struggle badly. But feral populations and adaptable species explode almost immediately. Rats, without human garbage and poison to manage them, actually see their populations crash at first, since so much of their food supply was tied to us. But within a decade, wild populations of deer, boar, and birds surge in numbers, no longer culled by traffic, hunting, or habitat clearing. The most dramatic evidence for this isn't hypothetical. It already happened, on a smaller scale, in a real place. When humans evacuated the area around Chernobyl in 1986, wildlife didn't die off. It came roaring back. Wolves, lynx, and elk now roam that exclusion zone in numbers higher than in many actively managed nature reserves nearby. Radiation turned out to be less dangerous to those populations than humans simply being there every day. Multiply that effect across the entire planet, and you start to see the shape of what a human-free Earth would actually look like. Within 500 years, most of our cities would be unrecognizable, buried under forest, marsh, or grassland, depending on the climate. Skyscrapers, stripped of glass and steel-skinned by rust and weather, would stand as hollow concrete skeletons, slowly being pulled apart by roots and ice. Within a few thousand years, almost every visible trace of modern civilization would be gone. Roads, cracked apart and swallowed by soil. Buildings, collapsed into overgrown mounds. Even the Eiffel Tower and the Golden Gate Bridge, without maintenance, would eventually rust through their support cables and fall. But here's the twist. Some things wouldn't disappear, not for a very, very long time. Plastic doesn't fully decompose. It just breaks into smaller and smaller pieces, eventually becoming microplastics scattered permanently through soil and ocean sediment, detectable for tens of thousands of years. Bronze statues, oddly, are remarkably durable and could still be recognizable 500,000 years from now. And deep underground, nuclear waste storage sites, along with the radioactive signature of every nuclear test ever conducted, would remain detectable for hundreds of thousands of years, a strange chemical fingerprint proving someone was here. Even Mount Rushmore, carved into solid granite, is estimated to erode at a rate slow enough that recognizable faces could still be visible in 10,000 years or more. And what about everything we've sent beyond Earth? The satellites orbiting right now would slowly lose altitude and burn up over decades or centuries, but a handful, parked in higher, more stable orbits, could keep silently circling the planet for millions of years, long after anyone remembers what they were for. The 2 Voyager probes, already drifting past the edge of our solar system, would keep traveling in near-perfect silence essentially forever, carrying a golden record of human voices and music to an audience that may never exist. There's something oddly humbling in that. Nearly everything we've built to last, our monuments, our cities, our proudest achievements, is temporary on a planetary timescale. The things that actually survive are usually the ones we didn't build to be remembered at all. A patch of plastic in ocean sediment, a radioactive trace underground, a machine drifting silently through space, forgotten by the very species that launched it. So if some future intelligence ever stumbled onto Earth, long after every city has vanished back into forest, they wouldn't find our skyscrapers, our roads, or our language. They'd find scattered microplastics in the sediment, a faint radioactive signature buried underground. And maybe, if they were very lucky, 4 enormous stone faces, staring out from a mountainside, the last stubborn evidence that something intelligent once stood here and built things meant to last forever. It didn't. But for a little while, it tried.